if you look at your budget in retirement and your income is a lot more than your budget, then you might not need as much as an emergency fund because you have some extra money each month that could be used for these unexpected costs that could come up.
Are you ready for a successful retirement? We're addressing the topics facing today's retirees. Welcome to Retire with Ryan. Now here's your host, Ryan Morrissey.
Welcome back. This week, I'm addressing the question of, do you need an emergency fund in retirement? I had a listener write in and they asked that very question. So in this episode, I'm going to address 4 things you need to know about having an emergency fund in retirement. Number 1 is, do you need an emergency fund? If you've attended one of my retirement readiness workshops that I teach at some local colleges in the area, you've probably heard me say that while you're working, everyone should have an emergency fund of at least 3 months of living expenses up to 6 months. And if you're in a job where there's more fluctuation in your pay, you're in a commission-based job, or you tend to change jobs more frequently, you might even want to have more than 3 months, maybe up to 12 months. But when you go to retire, things do change a little bit because now you're starting to get some income in retirement, income from Social Security, income from pensions. And that income is very reliable in retirement. Unless there's a complete collapse in our country, maybe even in the world, you're going to keep getting your Social Security check. You're going to keep getting your pension check. Whereas when you're working, you could find out that you've been laid off, that you've lost your job, and you might be eligible for a little bit of severance. You might not. But that's one of the prime reasons to have an emergency fund while you're working. When you're retired, you don't have to worry as much about losing that income. So your needs change a little bit. But I would say it's still a good idea, even in retirement, to have an emergency fund. This gives you flexibility so that if your investments go down in value, if part of your income in retirement is coming from your investment portfolio, then you want to have some money that's not invested in the market so that you could easily get access to it. This can also help cover you if an emergency happens, such as you have your furnace go out in the winter, or maybe your air conditioning in the summer, or you have a leak in your roof, or if you're in a car accident, your car dies. A number of things could cause you to need to get a hold of a large amount of money, or even a health-related event. So those things in retirement could really be a large out-of-pocket expense, and it's a good idea to have probably some type of emergency fund that you can access to cover these expenses. Now, the second thing to think about is how much should you have? And that really depends on everyone's situation. I know I mentioned earlier how having 3 to 6 months of living expenses is generally the recommended amount while you're working. In retirement, that is a little bit different, as I mentioned earlier, because you have other income coming in, Social Security, pensions, investment income, annuity income. So it depends how much income you have coming in versus your expenses. So it's always a good idea to have some type of a budget that you're following to know what expenses you have. And if you look at your budget in retirement and your income is a lot more than your budget, then you might not need as much as an emergency fund because you have some extra money each month that could be used for these unexpected costs that could come up. But if you are in a situation where your income matches pretty closely to what your expenses are, then you probably want to think about having more of an emergency fund. I'll be at least 3 months. It could be a little bit more depending on where your money is invested. If a lot of your money is in retirement accounts that are pre-tax retirement accounts, those are traditional IRAs, 401ks, meaning that every time you have to get money out of those accounts, you have to pay tax, then you probably want to have at least a 3-month emergency fund. If a lot of your money is in accounts where it's post-tax money, a lot of Roth 401ks and IRAs, then you might not need to have as much of an emergency fund because by taking money out of those accounts, it won't be as much of a tax hit to you. And this could be something that you build this up over time. You could, if you don't have any emergency fund now, you could start to build this up. Maybe when you take your money out monthly from your retirement accounts, you set part of that aside to slowly build up this emergency fund, or you just increase what you're taking out to give yourself a cushion to build up a little bit more in your emergency fund. Any distributions that you're taking from your retirement accounts, you should be projecting out for the year what your taxes are. And you want to be careful that by creating this emergency fund, you're not actually putting yourself in a higher tax bracket. So you definitely have to look at that if you're starting to create this emergency fund for yourself. The third thing to think about is where should you keep it? Well, it depends on what you feel most comfortable with, but also where you can have your money earn the most amount of interest for you. One option is a high yield savings account. Unfortunately, the term high yield really doesn't mean a whole lot these days. And if you were to go online, I usually recommend people go to bankrate.com and from there look at what the offers are for high yield savings accounts. Usually this is going to be through an online bank. You'll find that the best you could probably find right now would be about 0.5%. So what that means is that if you have $50,000, let's say, in your emergency fund, and you could earn 0.5%, that's earning you $250 a year. Now that's definitely real money, but it's not something that's probably going to make a big difference in many people's lives. So right now, it's not as big a deal whether you keep it in a high yield savings account or just a regular savings account. But that could change in the future if interest rates go back up to what they normally are at. Even a couple of years ago, you could earn 2.5% on these high yield savings accounts. So in that case, it definitely would be more impactful the larger the emergency fund that you have. You also could keep it in your Roth IRA retirement account. And I know I mentioned before how you could take money out of the Roth IRA and not pay tax. And that's one of the reasons why it would be okay, in my opinion, to keep your emergency fund in your Roth IRA, or just almost look at it as your Roth IRA as your emergency fund. Roth IRAs are a little unique in that if you follow the rules of a Roth IRA, that you've had the account open at least 5 years and you've reached the age of 59 and a half, then you could take out the whole account without any tax penalty. But even before then, you can always take out your contributions without any tax penalty. So let's just say, for example, you have a Roth IRA with $50,000 and you've contributed $30,000. So you have $20,000 of growth. The way the IRS treats any distributions is they look at your principal coming out first. So that means you could take out the whole $30,000 of contributions at any age before you'd have to pay any tax. And if you were over 59 and a half and the account had been open 5 years, then there would be no taxes. So that's why I like looking at the Roth IRA as an emergency fund. It's definitely not the best option because I'd love for you to leave your Roth IRA money invested as long as possible to get the maximum benefit by getting the most amount of tax-deferred growth and tax-free income. But in a situation where you don't have access to other money, that could be the best place to look rather than the traditional IRA or traditional 401k because that money's all taxable to you. You also could look too at taxable accounts that you have. If you have non-retirement money invested, taxable accounts, either in stocks or mutual funds, that could also be your emergency fund too, because that money is highly liquid. With a stock or a mutual fund currently, if you sell that investment, within 2 business days, you have access to the money. And within a couple days after that, that money could be transferred over to your bank account so that you could have access to it. So that money has the potential to fluctuate in value a lot more than it would if it was in a money market account or a CD, but it still is money that you could access. You could almost look at that too as an emergency fund. So this brings me to my fourth point of where not to keep the money. Definitely don't keep it in places that are going to cause you penalties to get it, or the money isn't going to earn you a whole lot. So examples of that would be considering your traditional IRA or traditional 401k, as I mentioned before, as an emergency fund. It's not a great place, even though the money is liquid, available within 2 business days, just like I mentioned before with the stock or a bond account, the money is taxable. The other thing is that if you're not 59 and a half and you want to take that money out, there could be a 10% penalty that applies to taking that out. So that's another reason why not to look at that. And in advance of retirement, it could make sense to maybe take a little bit more out of your traditional IRA or 401k and set it aside so that you have that money and you've already paid tax on it and you know it's available to you so that you build up that emergency fund. That could be another option as well. So I hope this has been helpful about how to set up an emergency fund, how much you should keep an emergency fund. And if you have your own listener question, please feel free to write in. Go to retirewithryan.com. And I've moved my contact button. It's now at the bottom of the page. If you scroll to the bottom of the page, you'll see contact. And from there, you can enter your name and your question, and I'll do my best to answer it in a future episode. Have a great holiday Christmas season, and I look forward to talking to you next Wednesday. Take care.
You should consult a financial advisor familiar with your specific circumstances before you make any financial decisions. Nothing in this broadcast constitutes a solicitation for the sale or purchase of any securities. Any mention of rates of return are historical or hypothetical in nature and are not a guarantee of future returns. Ryan Morrissey, CFP, is an investment advisor representative of Morrissey Wealth Management, LLC, a registered investment advisor.